Recorded live from Hong Kong and Toronto. Let's go. This is the PR and Law Podcast.
The PR and Law Podcast.
Turn it up. With your hosts, Cam McMurchie and Ewan Christie.
Welcome to episode number 51 of the PR and Law Podcast. I'm your host, Cam McMurchie, along with Ewan Christie.
Hello, Cameron.
Ewan's an employment lawyer and partner at Duntroon LLP in Toronto, Canada, and his firm is online at duntroon.law. I'm a PR guy in Hong Kong and publisher of the Digital Bits PR and Communications newsletter, and you can find that at digitalbitspr.com. If you enjoy the podcast, please tell a friend, and you can follow us on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and we've also got channels on YouTube and SoundCloud, and of course our newsletter, Ewan, PRLawPodcast.Club. What's happening? I think things are not very good over there in T-Dot, are they?
No, it's pretty bad, Cam. It's pretty bad.
Yeah, I'm hearing. And not just there, but elsewhere in the country, too.
Yeah, I mean, we had the second worst day of the pandemic last week, Cam, in terms of case numbers, new case numbers. Yeah, we're on full lockdown all over again. So we're well in the thick of a third wave. It's pretty bad.
You know, it's interesting how these things kind of ebb and flow, though, because here we're down to no cases a day, many days. I think we had one yesterday. So it's really in control and people are upbeat. But there's been other places such as Thailand where they've kept control of the virus the entire time. But now they're seeing 1,000 cases a day. They've had a huge spike down there just as they were getting ready to sort of reopen for tourism. So, I think the lesson here is even when the case numbers get quite low, it's no guarantee that things will continue that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think in Thailand, I mean, they were way behind in their vaccinations as well, right? I think they only started vaccinating like the end of March or something like that.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's sort of two sides to it, I guess, like sort of containing the outbreaks and then, vaccinations. I think the U.S., Israel, a few other countries we talked about before have done a good job vaccinating. Mine has been moved, though, Ewan. I think I might have mentioned this because, there was a problem with the Pfizer vaccine, at least with some of the packaging of a case of it in Hong Kong. So they delayed it for a couple of weeks. So now my shot isn't till the 19th, but I still can't wait to get it.
Right. But when you talk about a delay, you're talking like
2 weeks. Yeah. 10 days.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's great.
Not a big deal.
Yeah.
There's another thing I wanted to mention, Ewan, because, we've been talking on this show about work from home and we had kind of a debate about that. I think it was last week. But, what's interesting is there's some stories that have come out, Ewan, where I think the New York Times had one, and I'll put a link in the show notes, where people are very resistant to go back into the office. And some companies are having a hard time with this. Trivago, which is a travel sort of website, travel company in Germany, it decided after COVID-19 to let employees work remotely for 3 weeks and then come into the office for 1. And even that didn't work. They said employees came in 2 or 3 times that week, and they saw it as more of a social time to have coffee and muffins. But that they're really resistant to returning back to the office. And, there's a couple stories on this. I think it's something employers are going to have to deal with at some level. Yeah.
I mean, look, I think employers are going to play nice on this in the short term, at least, to try and let employees, adapt to getting back to a workplace environment. But I mean, I think on a long enough timeline, Cam, we're going to see a lot of employers who are just saying, no, you have to come back. Because they do. I mean, that's the thing. Employees, at least, here in Ontario and a lot of other jurisdictions, they don't have the discretion to say, yeah, you know what? I'm just going to work from home. I'm going to keep working from home. If your employer wants you to go back, I mean, unless you have some very, very clear medical reason or it's somehow discriminatory or you're returning to an unsafe work environment, if your employer wants you to go back, you have to go back. That's the way it goes. And I think on a long enough timeline, employers they're going to start pushing on this a little bit more, I think.
I don't think that's the point. Like, obviously, if employers want people to come back, they have to come back. I think the point is that employees large enough numbers of them are demanding this as a work-life balance or a way to work. And so I think there's going to be increasing pressure on employers to allow this to some degree. I think that's more of the issue. Obviously, if employers put their foot down and say, you got to be here at 8:30 Monday morning, they have to go. But I do wonder because, we have gone through a full year almost where, a lot of people have been able to get their work done remotely. And so there's a question over whether it is necessary. And I guess, I guess the part that bothers me is that automatic assumption of, when things are back to normal, you go to the office. Because it means that we haven't learned anything over the past 12 months. Like, I think we have to sort of break that link between productivity and being at work. Do you know what I mean? Because I think that does apply to a lot of people, but it also doesn't apply to a lot of people. They can be productive elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I mean, there's been, as we've talked about so many times on this show, Cam, a fundamental culture shift around work. And I think that's the part that's going to be sustained, well past pandemic and, everybody being vaccinated, et cetera, et cetera. And at a certain point, I think it's going to be something that prospective employers or employees are going to look at when they're considering where to work, right? I mean, if you have sort of two job options available to you, and one of the options is, no, you have to physically be in the office 5 days a week or, however many days a week. And then you have the alternative of a work from home a couple days a week and work from the office. Yeah. I mean, these things are going to be draws for a lot of prospective employees. And that's going to be a consideration employers are going to have to sit back and seriously explore. What are we going to do? I mean, how are we going to address this? And some employers are better situated to doing that than others. By nature of the fact that a lot of them were already supportive of a work from home program pre-pandemic and had the infrastructure set up. And, for a lot of employers, I think it will be business as usual, but there's no shortage of old school businesses that are still out there, Cam, who still believe, rightly or wrongly, that employees can't be productive unless they're sitting at their desk in the office, right? And by office, I mean that bricks and mortar office that the employer rents.
Yeah, and I really hope that changes because it does seem like a very dinosaur view at this point. Because, at the end of the day, right, like you have, as an employee, you have deliverables or you have responsibilities or you've got a portfolio of work that, sits with you. And theoretically, the timeliness and quality of that work should really determine whether you're succeeding or not or being productive or not. But that's a bit of a utopian idea, I guess. But one more thing on this, just before we move on. The interesting thing I found looking through some articles on this is the one thing that came up that bothered employees the most was the commute. That is why they wanted to work at home. Actually, there was very little concern about actually being in the office because, once you're there, yeah, you can talk to people. Some people said it was distracting. That's my number one issue. When I'm in the office, there's people coming by, people phoning me, people wanting to chat, even about work or not work. And I find it really distracting and it sort of breaks up my working flow. So that's my biggest issue. But the commute is a real one. I think a lot of people who have sort of taken commutes for granted that it's going to take 45 minutes or an hour to drive into work and then realize they can do their work at home. That's now a really tough sell because that's a lot of time. It might be 2 hours, 2.5 hours when you combine your commute, from door to door. And I think people have found that time can be much better spent.
Continue the debate with us on social media. Join us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at PRLawPodcast. All one word, PRLAW Podcast. Send us your questions now by email to askus@PRLawPodcast.com. That's all one word, askus@PRLawPodcast.com. Or on social media with the hashtag PRLawPod. That's hashtag PRLAWPOD.
Okay, Ewan, take it away.
Well, Cam, we're going back to Alabama.
All right.
We talked about,
love it.
If you recall last week, we were chatting about the Union Drive at the Amazon warehouse in Bessemer. Well, the votes are in, Cam. Mm-hmm. Any guesses?
Well, I know the result.
Oh, you do? Okay.
I do. Yeah. Well, it's one of those stories where I got blasted by like 50, news alerts on my phone. So, but
me too.
The drive failed. I understand.
Yes, it did. Yeah. And it's interesting, the legs that this story had. It got a lot of press here in Canada as well. I mean, it's clearly a big deal, even outside of sort of typical labor circles, which is interesting to see.
Well, you know what? Actually, on that point, Ewan, the reason for that, like, these are the stories that are the biggest because they touch several different areas. I mean, it's kind of a tech story because it's Amazon, but it's a labor story. And it's also just sort of a story of it's not manufacturing, but because there's so many jobs involved, like, it just touches on so many different parts of the economy, e-commerce, all of this stuff. So that, that's why it gets so much play.
Yeah, I agree. It is. It's a really sort of interesting, multifaceted story. Anyway, in terms of the vote, yeah. So, I mean, there were 5,876 eligible voters, only 3,117 cast ballots. So that's kind of an interesting stat right off the top.
What's normal for that? Do you know? Like, when there's a union drive, about what is the average participation rate?
I mean, I don't know. I wouldn't say that there's an average participation rate. I mean, it really, really, really depends. So, I don't want to say that there's a specific threshold you would typically see. I mean, of the votes that were cast, there were 1,798 cast against the union and 738 for. And again, the union, for anybody who's not familiar with the story, we're talking about the retail, wholesale, and department store union. But yeah, they got less than 30% of total votes, Cam. That was it.
Yeah. And I mean, I haven't looked into a lot of the fallout from this or what happened or what the reactions have been. I mean, obviously the company is going to be thrilled with this result. I think, not because just these 5,000 workers won't be union members, but that, they've headed off, a potential drive that could affect other parts of the company and other places. So, I mean, it's quite good for them. But what happens to the employees now, and what's the fallout been from this vote?
Yeah, well, I mean, the union, for its part, they're already asking federal labor officials to investigate. The unions filed unfair labor practice charges against Amazon. They're alleging that Amazon created an environment of coercion, that there were fear of reprisals against workers. Of course, Amazon has denied all of this. I mean, specifically, Cam, we're talking about for the better part of 7 weeks, workers were allegedly forced to attend anti-union meetings. I mean, things like
legal? I feel like this should be illegal, or is illegal, or is it okay?
Well, yeah, that's a great question, Cam. So, I want to put some links in the show notes. There's been some really fantastic articles written about just this subject and just how much range the employers have in the United States in terms of, anti-union sentiment. And there's just so much gray area here, particularly when you're talking about a company of Amazon's stature and money. But yeah, I mean, it's some of the stuff where, there was these meetings. And then in addition to that, workers were allegedly bombarded with anti-union texts. There were even flyers placed in the bathrooms. So, I mean, given the number of unfair labor practice charges, Cam, I wouldn't be surprised if the union ultimately wins the right to hold another election, and that's not uncommon. It's not uncommon for union organizers to make multiple attempts before they successfully unionize a workplace. So I don't think that this story is over at this particular plant, but we'll see what happens.
As somebody who knows nothing about this subject, I find that also kind of odd that they can vote, lose, and then just keep voting until they keep holding these until they win. That also seems like maybe not the best way to do it, but I guess it's normal.
Well, yeah, it kind of is. I don't want to say it's rare for a union to be successful on their first shot and trying to get into a work environment, but it's certainly not uncommon for there to be multiple attempts. But I think you were right off the top. I mean, the obvious point here is that Amazon has definitely dodged a bullet, right? Particularly as, we were chatting about this last week, the working conditions, the increased pressures on employees at Amazon during the pandemic. It's really, really put Amazon under the microscope.
Yeah.
And it sort of looked as though that the union might have some legs here. Amazon they'd been facing pressure from Washington, which is something we haven't really seen over the last couple decades around these issues. I mean, both President Biden and Bernie Sanders had sort of indicated some level of support for the drive. Ultimately for Amazon, they launched an aggressive campaign, and it clearly proved to be successful, right? I mean, they were arguing that workers already were paid better than sort of comparable positions at other companies, and that they had good benefits. And I guess on some level, they were successful in those arguments.
Yeah. And, Amazon is well known for being ruthless. I mean, these sorts of issues have come up in the past. I'm not sure if you followed Ewan, but there was some sort of angry tweets that Amazon put out a couple of weeks ago related to this issue. Where they were quite critical of, Bernie Sanders, for instance, on Twitter, and they were really firing back at politicians. And, it was a story I was thinking of actually bringing onto the show to discuss, because it was such an interesting way for the company to try and tackle some of these issues, because it was aggressive. And, usually that's not what is recommended on the communication side. But it came to light later that this is Jeff Bezos, and this is his style, and he was getting fed up with politicians and others sort of hammering at Amazon. And so he decided to fight back that way. And it backfired. It didn't look good. It didn't look good on the company. But I think this goes to sort of what you were talking about, earlier, that Amazon, these are important issues to the company. And Jeff Bezos is a fighter. And, it doesn't surprise me that they were putting up, signs in bathrooms and pressuring employees to try and vote one particular way. Because I think that's sort of how they do business. And I guess they would say that this is, how they run a tight ship, and how they keep costs down, and how they're able to provide, the service that they do provide to, millions of people who, enjoy that service. So yeah, you're right, Ewan. This is not the last we're hearing of this, for sure.
No, not at all. This is, I think one thing here, Cam, that we should look at is just, the general sort of trend around unionization over the last, say, 40 years, right? I mean, we've really seen increased privatization of industry, increasing corporate opposition, and that's had a dramatic effect on the unionization rates, right? I was looking at, in prep for the show, I was looking at a study from the Economic Policy Institute. U.S. employers spend about $340 million a year on consultants to help keep workers from unionizing. And these tactics, they're incredibly effective, right? And if we sort of look at the percentage of union workers over the last 40 years, that percentage of workers, it's dropped by half. So, I mean, not an insignificant swing, and I recall you and I chatting about this last week, Cam, off air. We were chatting about Scott Galloway and his sort of take on unions and how they continue to have an image problem, right? One of the other issues I think that they're struggling with is, how do you connect with millennials and Gen Z, right? If you think about the drop in unionization rates over sort of the last 40 years, really there's a greater chance now that millennials and Gen Zers have been raised in a home where their parents did not work in unionized environments. That sort of culture and education around unionization that, say, our parents were part of, and that we grew up around, it's simply not as prevalent as it once was. And I think that that's something that unions really have to sit back and try and address. Yeah,
you're right. I kind of agree with Scott Galloway in the sense that I'm not sure unions are the answer. He did say, are there other vehicles or other mechanisms or other structures that might better protect or negotiate on behalf of labor? I'm not sure. I mean, obviously that's a big question for people much smarter than myself, but I mean, I do see his point. I do think the branding around labor unions has been quite poor. And I mean, that's for a number of reasons, but it's just still there. And also the working conditions now and the economy now is so much different from the 40s, 50s, and 60s when the labor union was growing to become so strong in the United States. It's such a different world now. Like there are far fewer blue collar jobs, for instance. There's not 100,000 people, building automobiles at GM in Detroit. And I think, there's still obviously employers who are exploiting their labor for sure, but it's being done sort of in a different way. And I think we got to think differently about how to try and balance this.
I certainly don't disagree with your latter point that we have to think differently about how to deal with this, right? I mean, I think there's no doubt that there's been an explosion of precarious employment. We've talked about the gig economy. I certainly see this in my practice, the frequency with which I have clients coming in that have worked with the same company for 30 years and are retiring, are becoming fewer and far between. That's simply just not the reality of the working world anymore. We do not see people working for one or two companies and retiring with good pensions. And
working for one or two companies, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Like, to me, that's neither here nor there. Like, you might work at one or two companies, or you might work at 6 by the time you retire, but it's not inherently positive or negative on either side. I think what you're getting at there, before I rudely cut you off, was that sometimes the benefits are impacted by this. And if you're bouncing around a lot, there might not be that pension or that healthcare coverage at the end of the line.
Well, I don't think whether you bounce around or not, those pensions, they don't exist.
Yeah,
I mean, they have largely disappeared. Yeah. The percentage of positions where you can have access to those types of benefits no longer exist. So I don't actually think that that's reflective of whether you bounce around a lot or whether you don't. I do think that there's been a fundamental culture shift. Whereas if you go back to, say, the 50s and 60s, there was sort of this understanding that if you were working for a company and the work was generally decent and your pay was generally decent, you stuck around. It wasn't, there wasn't this sort of cultural ideal of, well, what's the next best thing? Or is there another option out there for me to sort of make a move or make a lateral move? Whereas it's sort of difficult to try and conceptualize the workplace nowadays without that particular mindset, right? I mean, I think most employees on some level are thinking about some form of upward trajectory. And if that doesn't exist with their current employer, then they're not hesitant about making a move to something better, right?
Yeah. As a manager, I like this. Like, I want the employees to be ambitious and hardworking and aiming towards something better, because ultimately I benefit from that as a manager, right? I think it is the people who sort of are content and satisfied and, and come in and this is it, that I often have problems with, because it's just a different outlook, I think. I mean, I'm really overgeneralizing here. But I do think the attitude is good. I'm not even sure if it's what's better, if it's just growth and challenging yourself and learning and, new experiences. All of this kind of comes into the job market as well. And I think it does sort of matter to people. On the pension side, and it's funny that you bring this up, because, we've invested in one or two sort of, real estate investments, right? And I've had my parents say, like, well, why are you not, buying yourself a nice home to live in and, and enjoy and spread out and, it'll be good. And I always tell them, because I'm not going to have a pension. I knew a long time ago that there wasn't going to be that net to catch me when I'm 55 or 65 years old. So it's not like, I've got decades of planning for this underway already, because you're right, it's not there. And that reality impacts how we live today for many people.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that may be very much part of that cultural shift, that we've made that sort of that transition psychologically, because we know that we have had to make that transition psychologically, because that safety net does not exist the way that it once did.
Show your support to the PR and Law podcast by making a one-time donation or setting up a subscription with us on Patreon. Every little bit helps us keep the lights on and bring the show to you each week. If you'd like to chip in, please visit PRLawPodcast.com. That's PRLawPodcast.com. Click support the show. Thanks for helping us out.
Okay, you and I have to drop a little plug here for myself. I will be speaking at the Marketing 360 Influence conference. It's actually holding a conference with the title Boot Camp for All Things Content and Communications. You can register for this online. I'm going to be a panelist on 2 sessions. One of them deals with sort of creating content on a very tight budget. And the other one, which I think is extremely interesting, it's on the issue of whether and how brands should take a stand on social issues. And this is something that we have touched on this course. And I thought, this is going to be an interesting discussion. And so I thought I would bring it up in the podcast today as well, because we've obviously seen some movement on this, even in the past week. So, I mean, you're familiar with what happened with Major League Baseball, I guess, over the last week. They were set to, not even just the last week, but, they were set to have the All-Star game in Atlanta, Georgia. And Georgia has recently passed a law pertaining to elections that does restrict access to the polls in reality. I mean, it doesn't state so very, very clearly, but in reality will result in some restrictions to voting for certain parts of the population. We can guess which parts those are. And, Major League Baseball has pulled its All-Star game out of Georgia, and it's been hammered for that decision, by Republicans who, support this piece of legislation. And Major League Baseball, which is not political. I mean, I think most sports leagues try not to be political, with maybe the exception of the NBA. And I think the NFL has become political since Colin Kaepernick. But this is something the MLB does not want to get involved with. And it's something that a lot of other companies are landing in as well. So Coca-Cola, Delta are 2 others that have been criticized for what's happening in Georgia. And Coca-Cola spoke out about it. Donald Trump then spoke about about Coke's opposition to this law in Georgia. And he's calling it woke-a-cola. And, this is tough. Companies are landing in this situation, Ewan. And it's not easy. And there's a lot on the line. And I think, this is becoming something that companies have to really consider day to day. We've talked on this show in general about the fact that, there are certain issues that come up. We talked about Black Lives Matter, and the death of George Floyd, things like that, where you have one case maybe every few years or every decade where there's enough social pressure, on your company to speak. But now this is an ongoing issue, it looks like.
Yeah, look, I have no issue with Major League Baseball pulling out. I think it was a good move. I think it's good for the development of its brand long term. And here's the thing. This idea that American sports haven't been politicized for a very long time, it to me is just completely ludicrous. First of all, I mean, you think of looking specifically at Major League Baseball, Cam. If you recall, after the September 11th terrorist attacks, one of the first things that Major League Baseball did was it changed the 7th inning stretch to, people singing God Bless America. It was no longer Take Me Out to the Ball Game. Now, look, I'm not passing judgment on that decision. However, that decision was an overtly political one that Major League Baseball chose to make. And I mean, as far as I understand, this is still what you sing during the 7th inning stretch at Major League Baseball games, at least in the United States, is God Bless America. I can say that here, if you come to see a Blue Jays game in Toronto, we still sing Take Me Out to the Ball Game.
Oh, no, we were in Seattle just 2 years ago. They sang Take Me Out to the Ball Game at the 7th inning.
Did they?
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe they no longer do this. I don't know, or maybe they only do it at select parks. But that was certainly an overtly political decision. You think of the Super Bowl with the idea of military jets flying over, or the integration of the military into American sports in general. And again, I'm not passing judgment on this one way or the other. But to suggest that professional sports haven't been politicized in the United States for some time, I think is kind of inaccurate.
Well, I guess we should clarify here. I mean, if you're talking about sort of patriotic sort of messages for sure. But I think in terms of Republican versus Democrat, that's an area where sports leagues have tried to avoid, just because, you're going to alienate half of your audience regardless. And so baseball is very careful about not wading into those kinds of issues. If it's, singing the national anthem or singing God Save America or whatever, God bless America. Yeah, it's God Save the Queen.
We're Canadians, people. We're Canadians. Please.
I was thinking God Save the Queen. So I do think those things are a little bit different. But one thing that I've noticed out of this, Ewan, is it's very similar to what China has been doing. I mean, in the US, it is elected officials now pressuring companies, but that's what's been going on in China for a very long time. And I think most recently, we had an issue over Xinjiang cotton. So, Xinjiang is a majority Muslim territory in China. It used to be called East Turkestan before it was part of China. And I mean, if you read news articles about this, there's some serious human rights violations happening in Xinjiang. And, H&M had put out a statement, saying that it was not going to use Xinjiang cotton any longer. And, that got picked up in the Chinese media and with Chinese consumers. And H&M is persona non grata in China now. It's done. It's completely done. In fact, it's to the point where landlords have kicked them out of shopping malls. They've just closed their shops. If you open Didi, which is sort of China's version of Uber, in which Uber has invested, you can't. If you try and get picked up at an H&M, they won't. Your transaction won't go through. You can't even be standing out front of one to get picked up. I mean, it's a
what?
Yeah, it's
really? It's like geo-blocked or something.
Yeah, you can't. There's no way to do that. So. And this is China is not, it's no longer we want access to this growing market. It came out 2 weeks ago that, China's going to overtake the US market in size by 2028 ahead of schedule because of the COVID-19 situation where their economy's been growing for, 6 to 8 months already, post pandemic. But this has put, H&M is in trouble. Nike was targeted. Adidas was targeted, several other brands. And they've since issued, groveling apologies and talking about how they support Xinjiang, things like that. But it is interesting to see this now turn up in the United States where the same thing is happening. And it's all part and parcel of the same thing. These companies don't want to do this. I can guarantee you. They don't want any part of this at all. But this is becoming so polarized that they're being forced to choose. And I think, as widespread as this has become already, I think it's going to get a lot worse. I think some companies like Apple are extremely vulnerable. If we're talking about the China example, a huge chunk of their business, is in China. But it's not the only one. There's a lot of brands that are having to deal with this. And I think, in the United States, going back there for a sec, I mean, you remember the Chick-fil-A controversy.
Yeah.
There's so many examples of this. So what can companies do, in this situation? And, I don't have a good answer. I hate to sort of bring that up that way and I bring up this subject today because I do want our audience to think about it as well. I mean, from my perspective and in my current role, there have been societal issues that have come up and we've considered whether to speak or not. And there is not yet a clear blueprint or guideline for how to go about this. But off the top of my head, I mean, one area is this related to our business or not? And if it's not related to your business, that doesn't mean necessarily that you shouldn't say something. Maybe you should. People kind of laugh in North America, Ewan, about boycotts and, are boycotts really effective? And, they're not often, even in cases on Fox News where, companies are pressured, for instance, not to sponsor Tucker Carlson's show on Fox. They do drop off, but then they resurface again a few weeks later and it continues. So they're not effective in general, but I think they're getting to be more effective. And I think with Republicans really putting the pressure on companies like Major League Baseball, I do think they could do some economic damage. I really do. And it's a really tough situation to be in.
On what level could there be blowback by these businesses with the Republican Party as well? I mean, because I saw earlier in the week there was it Lindsey Graham who said, the corporations have no place or no business making, taking political stances or something to that effect, to badly paraphrase the statement. And of course, somebody very quickly pointed out, but wait a minute, where does a lot of your donations come from? They come precisely from these corporations. So to suggest that corporations aren't entitled to take a particular political stance on an issue isn't particularly accurate with how the American system works, or doesn't work, frankly, as the case may be, right?
Yeah, exactly. And Ewan, the other recent development here is a number of chief executives of large U.S. companies actually held a Zoom call over the past several days to talk about banding together on this to speak out against the Georgia law. And I think this is an interesting development. So some of the companies that were on this call, Pepsi, PayPal, T. Rowe Price, Hess Corp, there were several executives on the call. And, I think this is a good way to handle it, because I think if companies, they are stronger together, right? Like you can't boycott everyone. You have to buy your goods from somewhere. And I think this is kind of a creative way to kind of inoculate the business, from any widespread boycott effort.
Wait a minute. Check this out.
Whoa, hey, check this out.
No, wait. Oh, check it out.
I want you to check this out.
On the PR and Law podcast.
All right, what do you got, Ewan?
Yeah, I read a fantastic article in the Washington Post titled The Strange Journey of Cancel, from a black culture punchline to a white grievance watchword. And
I like this already.
It sort of details the origin of the term, like, you're canceled, the origins of cancel culture. And I was not at all familiar with this. And it's a really interesting story that dates back to the early 80s and involves Nile Rodgers, Cam, who you may know from the band Chic, the 80s band. Anyway, the whole story links back to a bad date that Nile Rodgers had in the 80s.
Really? Okay. Elaborate.
Yes. So he was at a club, and the maitre d' came over, and he was going to sit Nile and his date, and his date insisted that the maitre d' remove all of the people who were sitting at one of the tables so that they could have it to themselves. And Nile Rodgers basically had to sort of interject and say, "Yeah, no, I don't roll like that. That's not what I do." And that effectively was kind of the end of the date. That's how it went. And he went home, and he was kind of going over the event while he was working on a new song, which ended up being titled "Your Love is Canceled."
Oh, really?
Yes, that was the name of the song. And that is the first incident that we know of, first reference of this idea of being canceled. And from there, Cam, it's really interesting. So the line then shows up in the 90s gangster flick New Jack City, and then again in rapper 50 Cent's 2005 track Hustler's Ambition. And then it made its way to reality TV in VH1's Love and Hip Hop. But it all goes back to a bad date that Nile Rodgers had, and of course has been appropriated in a whole host of ways since that time.
Wow. I had no idea of the background on that. And the interesting thing is, it isn't still well defined. This term is going to be around for a long time, and it's going to be used by all kinds of different people in different ways. I see how some people are calling it accountability culture. I think that's putting a positive spin on it. But anyway, I don't want to get into all this because we could be talking forever about cancel culture, but I definitely want to read that. It does sound interesting.
What you got?
All right.
Come on.
Oh yeah, it's the notorious B.I.G. I remember the rap sort of East-West feud back from the 1990s. And it was Biggie on the East Coast in Brooklyn, and it was Tupac out in California. And, both of them ended up dead. They were both shot, both murdered. Both of those crimes are unsolved at this point. But anyway, I do remember this from the 90s, and I mean, I remember the music, obviously, but not much more than that. And just recently, I had a friend sort of listening to one of these songs, Hit 'Em Up, which is done by Tupac. And I was listening to the lyrics, and I went, wow, this song is really harsh, and it's sort of really taking a piece out of Biggie. And, after that, I went just reading again, just out of curiosity. I went down the rabbit hole, and I found a podcast special on Slate's Slow Burn podcast. They look at a different issue every season, and season 3 they looked at the East-West rap battle. And I really thought it was really well done. It's an 8-part series, and it looks at sort of the background of hip hop and rap, and set the stage from the late 1980s with NWA. And Ice Cube and on into the 90s with Biggie and Tupac and all of the other host of characters, Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg and all of these guys. So it's a really good podcast series. I do recommend it. So then the second one, Ewan, is actually a Netflix special. I just learned the other day that Netflix has put together a documentary on the life of Christopher Wallace, also known as Notorious B.I.G. And I mean, I have to say, it's really interesting. It focuses on his life more than the feud with the West Coast. But his life, there's a lot of stuff in there that I was not aware of. And there's a lot of, home movie style footage, with some of his good friends who went on tour with him around the United States. And I guess a lot of this footage has basically never been seen before. So I would say I liked it. I think if you're a fan of this era or these two guys, B.I.G. or Tupac, it's probably worth a listen. I thought it was a little bit light, on the actual feuding between the two sides. It was more of sort of a look at Biggie's past. But I mean, both of those for sure. If you're into this, if you remember it, if you're a bit nostalgic, this is a two great bits of entertainment.
Okay, so start with the podcast.
I would go with the podcast. I think that's the stronger one. Yes.
Okay, good. And that's where I'll start because I definitely I remember this. And look, I mean, it's just tragic any way you cut it. I mean, you had just two brilliant artists cut down in their prime. And the hip hop community's never been the same since, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And just the impact that they had. Like I've even gone back in the last couple of years. I've been listening to some 90s era hip hop actually as a result. And it's I remember back then it was sort of seen as maybe a fad, like hip hop or rap was kind of just a 90s thing, might fade away. And it's been exactly the opposite. It's a whole new genre really that really got its footing back then in the 90s.
Absolutely. Yeah. Hip hop rules, man. No doubt about it.
Yeah.
Maybe the guitars will come back at some point in time, but it's a different world out there now.
Yep.
It's great.
All right, Ewan, we're getting set to wrap this one up. Anything you want to add? Anything to wish our wonderful listeners before we close?
Well, yeah, Cam, I do actually. I want to wish you a happy belated birthday.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. I know it was your birthday earlier this week. I hope you had a good one.
Yeah, it was lovely. I mean, I talked about the holidays here in Hong Kong. We had a 5-day weekend last weekend. And so one of those days was the birthday, and it was great. Like I slept in, it was a sunny day, went down to the water, had a nice meal. It was wonderful, actually. Low key Fantastic. Is so good now. Look, I'm a nice time for me is nothing on the calendar and a nice IPA or a glass of whiskey and chill out. Wow.
So you must just be loving this pandemic then, Cam, because it's pretty much been low key, stay at home pretty much every day for the better part of a year or over a year now.
Interestingly, I actually went out on Friday evening because the bars are open here and they have been for a while. And, there was a bunch of people inside of a bar and I was with a couple of friends and we had masks off and we were drinking pints. And we're at that stage here because there's no cases anymore. And, we were talking at the time saying in most of the world, you can't do this. You can't sit around and order pints and chat with friends. Yeah, it's sort of a sobering moment to say, wow, we're quite fortunate to be able to even do this at all.
Right. Yeah. Even psychologically, haven't you just noticed when you're watching old TV shows or old movies, and you see people embrace or sharing an elevator or just getting, physically close with each other. You're thinking, what are you doing? What are they doing? What's going on?
Don't they know?
Oh, right. You have to do that double take in your head. It's so weird.
See, I get this when I see like sports highlights from a long time ago, and I go, oh, there's fans in this stands. That looks so cool.
Right.
Because that's so rare now. But anyway, they are coming back in the US in a lot of these cities. So, all right. Well, Ewan, let's wrap it. Thanks everyone again for joining us. You can obviously follow us on social media. Please do that. And get the word out about the podcast. It's the only marketing we've really got. So we do appreciate that. And you can get our newsletter as well, PRLawPodcast.Club, if you want to stay up to date with new episodes and any other show news that we have to share. So for you and Christy, this is Cam McMurchie. Light it up.
This has been the PR and Law Podcast with Cam McMurchie and Ewan Christie. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with a friend or leave a review. You can also join us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook by following our account at PR Law Podcast. That's all one word, PRLAW Podcast. Thanks for your support.